Welcome to another episode of the Ultideic Prophecies Podcast. I'm Todd Larson.
And I'm Bob Wyatt.
And today we wanted to talk about the nature of good and evil as it relates to human nature in particular, and how our view of human nature and good and evil play into our writing. And this is a bit of a deeper topic. Last week we talked about the nature of each of the deities in our pantheon of gods and the 8 religions that exist on Baon. And we mentioned that originally with the gods we had used 2 axes, good and evil on one axis and lawful chaotic on another axis, which is a traditional fantasy Dungeons and Dragons sort of diagram for plotting characters and gods and NPCs and monsters alignments. And we moved away from that in favor of a altruism versus egoism and collectivist or externally focused authority versus individual or internally focused authority, and individualism versus collectivism on maybe another axis. But we do care deeply and think deeply about human nature and what good and evil might look like within a multitude of contexts: politics, war, ethics, morality, a lot of different things. And so we wanted to talk a bit more about that today, because it isn't true that we aren't at all concerned with questions of good and evil. We're deeply concerned about
quite the opposite
notions, but our view of human nature doesn't fit neatly into a paradigm of good and evil, and so that's what we wanted to talk about. And so we thought where we'd start today is with where does the fantasy genre, how does it typically deal with questions of good and evil? How does it depict those struggles? And where has the fantasy genre evolved over time to deal with those topics differently? And subgenres approach those questions very differently. And then where maybe do we fit in? So starting with a bit of maybe more classical fantasy, going back to, let's say, Tolkien, and then moving forward. Tolkien had a very binary good versus evil. He was very steeped in his Catholic background, Judeo-Christian notions, at least as those were understood through Western thought, with sort of the forces of Satan and darkness, demonic forces, and humans certainly being tempted into aligning themselves with satanic forces in opposition
with the good
to
or the bad.
Good, which is God's will, righteousness, Jesus, on that side. And so Tolkien borrowed heavily, or he wrote Lord of the Rings very steeped in this notion of good and evil. And you see that depicted in sort of the heroic trope of Aragorn as the king, Gandalf as the wise man, the wizard, the hobbits as sort of an innocent, almost childlike in some ways, naive innocence, but good, fundamentally good.
Well, and I think that it's certainly not limited to Tolkien. I think fantasy in general, it really leans into that idea of good versus evil. Many fantasy stories are centered around the good or the righteous or the just side versus the chaotic or the evil. And I think that Tolkien is one of the ones that kicked that off, but certainly did not invent that. We see that in a lot of mythology and allegorical
Sure.
stories.
I mean, it goes back
throughout
forever.
time.
Like, I mean, the oldest
Yeah,
stories that we have
right.
of humans across the world, across time, like this notion of good versus evil is one of the oldest uh, storytelling tropes that there is. Like,
Right.
and not limited to fantasy. Like almost every
No, not at all.
genre of
Although,
story deals with this. Go ahead.
yeah, I think fantasy leans into it a little bit more.
It does, and
And we can see evidence of it in Star Wars, for instance.
yep,
You see
sci-fi.
a much more stark contrast between good and evil in much of fantasy, although we'll talk about some exceptions in modern fantasy and what some of the changes that were made. But even in Star Wars, you've got a clear good versus evil side. The good side often isn't nuanced, nor is the evil side. They leave those clear distinctions. A lot of modern stories tend to muddy that or have a more nuanced approach, which is not bad either, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah,
But
and
when we look at a lot of fantasy stories, we see that Tolkien's not by himself, or
no.
maybe they're following his lead and leaving it vague and some of the motivations unfulfilled or unrealized or at least not fleshed out, if those motivations existed at all.
Yeah, and we see, at least in my experience with stories, particularly fantasy, it is most of the depictions of evil in classical fantasy uh, involve at least non-human, if not supernatural forces, right? Like
Yes.
in Lord of the Rings, the Lord of Darkness is Sauron, and he's a supernatural being, a supernatural force of darkness. And you
Right.
see, you do see depictions of humans aligning themselves with him. So Saruman, classically, who's a Maya, uh, also aligns himself, as a wizard. Wormtongue does the same thing. There's betrayal. You see
Right.
there's a lot of background of the weakness of men. Classically, Isildur has an opportunity to destroy the One Ring and chooses not to and holds on to it, and
And
Galadriel,
Boromir's a good example of that also.
Boromir, yeah, so, and Denethor, like all of these characters are tragically tempted to align themselves with evil, but the source of evil is really depicted as, you know, Morgoth and his minions. I mean, even Sauron is, you
Yes.
know, a disciple or servant of the darkness, of the supernatural evil. And evil in the deepest evil, the purest evil in fantasy is often depicted uh, as supernatural forces, and humans are
Right.
tempted into alignment
And
with those forces, but they aren't themselves
agreed.
typically depicted as the source of the evil itself.
And I think there's value in that as well, in that fantasy is often escapism, and keeping it simple and clear sometimes
Yeah,
can be better for a reader. So there's value in having that clear cut difference,
sure.
just the all bad side and all good side, and the two are at each other's
They're
throats.
enemies. Yeah,
However, yeah, they're enemies, and there's no need to explain why Sauron is bad.
or explore
Uh,
uh, gray areas of gray
yeah,
between them.
yeah,
Grayness didn't exist
and
in
not to say they're yeah. Well, it does exist in that I think Boromir's a really good example of gray, but it also
I,
because there's the clear contrast, and he starts out being helpful and gets corrupted, but then he redeems himself to some extent. And by
yeah.
having that clear contrast, you can show more easily the fall and the redemption because
So
it's
so you
clear
have a fall into
where you
darkness and a
fall.
redemption at the end back
Yes.
into light. And
Yeah.
and
And that's a beautiful part of Tolkien's story.
it is,
One
and
of my
he
favorite parts.
he was trying to draw parallels to the eucatastrophe, which is a Tolkien term
Right.
for an unexpected turnaround of good fortune, the eucatastrophe of the resurrection and the atonement of Christ to redeem mankind is that there's the tragedy of mankind's fall in Christian thought, and the redemption of that through the eucatastrophe of Christ's intervention and atonement. And Boromir isn't so much a gray character as he is a very clean depiction of the fall from grace into catastrophe, and then the redemption back out of that. But he's not morally gray.
And in his mind, he wasn't. He doesn't switch necessarily. He never had the intention of helping Sauron, for instance. He thought he could control the ring.
He got corrupted by the evil
use it to his. So he was tempted, and he never fell to the dark side, to use the Star Wars term. But
not completely. He tried
was
to
willing to use dark side. Yeah, he was willing to use the dark side to try to help his own side, which would have been a disaster. And the reader knows that, but Boromir didn't. And he realized what he did and did his best to make amends and protect the Merry and Pippin. So, and again, great part of Tolkien's writing, but it doesn't work as well when you're telling a more nuanced depiction of good and evil. It works much better when you have those clean-cut sides that much of fantasy relies on.
So then we get sort of an evolution into much more leading towards grimdark fantasy, right? Like in the 80s and 90s, you had Conan the Barbarian, was a very gritty, grim depiction. Very little that was actually redeeming about it. I mean, Conan was somewhat heroic, but he was a very
but also
morally murky,
flawed and morally
morally murky character. And then in Wheel of Time, you start off with very clear distinctions, very Tolkien-esque.
The dark one and
the dark one,
the light.
Exactly.
The creator,
the Forsaken ones, who are the servants of darkness. Very akin to the Nazgul, the ring wraiths. Anyway,
right.
And but then in the late 90s, early 2000s, with A Song of Ice and Fire, Martin pulls us into a very different treatment of good versus evil, and he still has supernatural evil forces in his work, but they're, at least initially, way background. The White Walkers,
the White Walkers are a good example,
an
right?
Unknown threat beyond the wall, and you have the Lord of Light, who seems to have some,
sounds like
evil
he should
tendencies.
Be good, but then,
yeah. He's Seamus Sander, anyway. So there is some supernatural, but because Martin takes a very low fantasy approach to the supernatural, magical in his world, it's background much more. He's much more interested in what are humans doing, what's human nature, and I think Martin has a very grim view of human nature. But that's what he focuses on, and the evil that's depicted in the book is human agency, exercised for in very abusive, morally corrupt ways, and there's so much of it, and everyone. There's virtually no character who doesn't who doesn't base a substantial portion of their decision making on corrupt moral principles, right? There's just Ned Stark is maybe
in his
the
writing.
exception.
The Ned Starks, the Ned Starks of the world are the clear exception, and almost everyone else, and even with Ned to some extent, they're painted in shades of gray, and again, there's value in that too. He's able to tell a very nuanced. The characters that we loathe in the beginning of the story, we come to
Joffrey,
sympathize
Cersei, Jamie.
Well, yeah. I don't know
Those
if
are
we ever
less
sympathize
redeemable.
with.
Where you were going maybe as Jamie, who seems
that's exactly right.
despicable.
I didn't get very sympathetic towards Joffrey,
or Cersei,
except
honestly.
for maybe at the very last page.
Yeah, no, not
and
even.
And you
then.
go, ooh.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think those are good examples of that. Telling a morally great story, you're able to show to some extent a redemption bit by bit, rather than Boromir's redemption of the fall, realizing the error of your ways, and coming back and sacrificing yourself. A very, very clean redemptive arc. Jamie's is a very messy redemptive arc.
Yep.
In the Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
And
Brienne is a great counterpart to him, and their relationship between her sort of uncorruptible goodness versus his selfish corruption that brings him back to sort of his idealism in his youth before he became the Kingslayer. And it's interesting because of Tywin, their father's corruptive influence on all of his children. And you get to see later, and the TV show maybe played with this a bit more than is, in the books, but Tywin is clear. It becomes clear what a corrupting influence Tywin had on his children, and that's a fascinating aspect we don't need to get into. What I'd like to contrast what Game of Thrones did in terms of depicting good versus evil, which is really just different people. There wasn't a lot of good versus evil. I mean, even with Daenerys, who a lot of people thought was going to be coming in as a heroine and as a righteous sort of Aragorn type figure, she shows
it was greater evil versus lesser evil. I mean, that was really what the story was about.
One expression of evil versus another expression of evil, based on the notion that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which I think is Martin's view of the world and the Game of Thrones, or at least it's what he used as the basis for his moral philosophy in the Game of Thrones. I don't know if he personally sticks to that in all cases, but probably. I mean, he seems to. Now
it seemed to be the direction he was going. And I think Jon Snow probably, like Ned Stark, were the two the two exceptions.
Yeah.
Even Arya, who everybody loved, and it was a compelling story. She also did 1,000 uncomfortable things, and lived in the gray. Relished that role, and especially in the books where she's such a young girl. The show made her much older for obvious reasons, as it did with many of the characters.
Well,
but it made it even less comfortable to be in that morally gray area for somebody so young.
I agree, but I think what it shows, and we're going to get into this some more, it is that her. So unlike the fall of Boromir, right, where he's tempted by the evil of the ring, Arya is driven to evil by the abuse that she suffers at the hands of Cersei and Joffrey and all the other horrible things that she's exposed to. So it isn't the temptation to the evil side by like the supernatural force. It's the existing in a world that is itself corrupt and people who are abusive will drive otherwise innocent people, and including children, to cope with an evil world by turning to evil means themselves. And I think that's a lot of people's view of the world. Now, before we get there, because we're in comic book world, in the genre, superheroes, particularly like Marvel and DC, they likewise stuck for a long time with good versus evil. Superman, it was always good versus, like the supervillains in Superman were
you had the dastardly evil versus the unfailingly good.
Correct. Captain America, like the
Yep.
those in the comic books in the 30s, 40s, or 40s, 50s, through World War II, coming out of that era.
Yeah, I even think as far as into the '60s, although that's when
Yeah,
it seemed like it started to change. I'm
I mean
not
a
an expert
bit,
in that area,
but they
but
started to explore more morally gray
yeah,
options through the 80s and 90s. And
clearly, yeah,
Batman, and I'm going to turn to the movies for a minute. Batman
sure,
originally stuck with the classical 1960s 70s tropes of clearly good versus clearly evil. But when
yeah.
you got the um, is it Michael Nolan, who was the director of
No,
the
Christopher Nolan.
Christopher Nolan? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Christopher Nolan's version, uh,
yeah,
Batman is way more morally gray, right?
yeah,
And
and
he
and the antagonist or the villain in the movie is also morally gray.
correct, right? And we start to get into they aren't evil just because they're the for no explicable reason they just like to be evil. To You get a sense that there is some reason for them to be evil, similar to what happened with Arya, where an evil world pushed her to become evil. Now you don't quite get that in the Batman, but when by the time you get to what I would consider to be the pinnacle of uh, superhero storytelling with Avengers Endgame, uh, uh,
Uh huh.
Thanos as an antagonist at that point where he's
Yeah,
trying to rebalance the world for the benefit of those who survive. He's seeking the power to wipe out half of life, not because he has anything against life, but because he views that as a justifiable means to saving
yeah.
humanity, saving intelligent
It
beings.
it's parallel to things that have been bantered around on Earth, and it's it paints him as a villain who believes he's doing right or doing good, and
Right.
that's, I think, in many ways how most villains are, not necessarily in,
You
in
mean
literature and in stories,
on
but
Earth
in real
in real
life.
life? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and,
so
and so that's one of the things I think they did spectacularly well, is giving you the picture of a sympathetic villain, and obviously sympathetic is used loosely. Thanos still is a horrible villain. Ended up, in their storyline, I don't know, killing trillions, if not more than that. However, we understood why he was doing it. He was principled. He was sticking to his worldview, and he believed so much that he was right that he was willing to do what he acknowledged was a horrible thing.
yeah.
That, like I said, not exactly sympathetic, but it made you understand why he did what he did, why he was the way he was.
Yeah. So this
And I thought that was a really good job of storytelling by Marvel in that.
agreed. It was extremely well done. So this is much more in line with where you and I approach
Yeah.
our view of human nature, which well, why don't you take a shot at laying out what our view of good
Oh
and
yeah, give
evil in
give me the
human
easy
nature?
job. Yeah, we just for all of you listening at home as background, we've had a lot of conversations about human nature and good and evil. It's as you're talking about these things, I think it helps form your opinions, and I would venture to say that we're fairly closely aligned on most things. Although I know that we have some differences in how we see things, and that that's a great thing. I would expect that anybody, as close as we are and as much as we talk, I think anybody would have variations in their opinion, if they're a free thinker. The way we look at it, um, and this isn't a perfect way of explaining it, but we don't necessarily see anybody who is dastardly evil. There are very few exceptions in life where people are sadistically, dastardly evil. That's more of a caricature of what we see in real life. We see people who do things we would categorize as evil, and they think in their way of thinking that they're right and that that's justified. What we've often said in our modern lexicon today: one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, or one man's rebel is another man's hero. There's the distinction between those often is perspective. It doesn't mean there is not good and evil in the world. It means that the motivations generally tend to, in our worldview, the motivations generally tend to be that they believe that they're right or just in the actions that they're taking. That might be very selfish reasons. They believe that they are entitled, or they believe that what they are going to do is going to ultimately, like Thanos, alleviate human suffering by, in the short term, causing this, or creating order, which people need, even though they say they want freedom.
So let's get some basic definitions out on the table, because we're throwing around terms like good and evil and justified and unjustified, and a lot of things. But to be very concrete, how would you define evil?
In general, or do you mean how would we? Because I think we see evil as an unhealthy attempt to apply order to the world, or to satisfy needs. That's not.
So
go ahead.
So, you're drawing a distinction that is important, but I think we're jumping ahead a little bit. So to back up, evil is probably defined, and there's lots you could debate around this, but I think for our purposes, evil requires two things. One, it requires it is behavior that is intended to harm people and actually does severe harm to people. So there's a
requires
degree,
an outcome.
It can't be mild, right? Like, it's mildly evil. Like, that's a weird way to put it. Evil is in its nature an extreme version of harm to people, where that harm was either intended or at a minimum not given moral consideration, right? Like you were indifferent to someone's suffering, the suffering that would be caused by your behavior, knowing that there was either a high likelihood, a high propensity for harm, and you didn't care because you wanted the outcome regardless of the harm.
It doesn't require that you cause the outcome. It can also be indifference, or turning a blind eye to the suffering of others.
Right,
and obviously there are different types of evil.
Now just being indifferent to people suffering isn't. I don't know that we'd class, like, if I'm aware, but I don't give it a lot of thought day to day, that there are people in the world suffering. And it's not that I don't care that they're suffering. It's just that I feel so removed from it and so powerless really to do anything about it. Or maybe more appropriately, that with my limited resources, I'm focused on solving other problems. And so I just give it little thought at the end of the day, because I don't have the resources to do anything about it. It's not that I don't feel badly about it. It's just I don't have the mental and emotional and monetary time.
But there's a difference between indifference and a lack of bandwidth.
Correct, and that was the point I was trying to make. Not not being not spending a lot of your resources to address suffering in the world doesn't necessarily mean that you're indifferent. It can look like indifference, but
Agreed.
it that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is when you are directly causing something in the world through your action that will harm other people, and you're aware that it will or has a high likelihood of harming
Yeah.
people, and you don't care. You will take the action despite the risk or the actual harm that it'll cause. It is a form of evil that's akin to intentionally inflicting the harm, right? So the two essential components of evil are that it has to actually cause harm, and you have to intend or be indifferent to the harm that you're causing.
So by that definition, then, can a good person do evil?
Well, so a person can have it is a mix of doing good things and doing bad things. And so a good person, now you and I think both agree we're delving into what's
Yeah.
human nature, and evil,
Yeah, and I realize
as it relates to human nature, is a little bit different. So actions are much more cleanly defined or characterized as good or evil, right? And that mostly comes down to um, were people benefited or were they harmed, right? By the behavior. So the behavior is easily classified as either good or evil. Now, not every harmful behavior is evil, but every behavior
Agreed.
Every behavior that was intended or indifferent. I'm going to use intended as a shorthand. Just know that that implied with that is also indifferent, but it's slowing us down. So I'm going to say every behavior that was intended to harm people intentionally. That's redundant, but anyway, it is evil.
I was going to point that out. I'm sorry.
It's fine. So the and good behavior or actions that are good are those that benefit other people. Yeah. Now, the person who does good actions or bad actions, whether they should also be described or characterized as good or evil, is a much murkier question in our view, I think.
Yeah. In fact, I would go a step further to say that we don't see people as good or evil necessarily. They can do good or evil things, and there are certainly some people we can look at history that have perpetrated massive evils in the world. But does that mean the person is evil? I think we can put a much better definition on the acts that were done than on the human being that did them. And I'm always very hesitant to label others, whether it's a different group.
Yeah. For two reasons.
I don't generally practice that.
Yeah, and there's two reasons for that. One is, I think you and I agree that there is almost nobody who is 100% motivated in their actions to hurt people.
Right.
And there's no one in their behavior who's 100% motivated to benefit others. That there's just no one who falls. I mean, maybe Jesus is the one exception, but other than Jesus, there's no human being who's
on the
ever
benefit side
who lives 100% on one side or the other of that. So every person in their life is a mix of both and goes through periods and cycles of more good or more evil in their behavior, in their orientation. But no one is one or the other. And that's one reason.
I think
there's another reason.
Yeah, I also think that it's helpful to point out that there are people that probably become very closely aligned with the evil side, for instance. And usually we can point to a problem,
a disorder.
that there is something wrong there's a disorder, or they have become so conditioned gradually. Yeah. We recognize that there are serial killers in the world, and
most of them suffer from
everybody's next door neighbor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Almost all of them suffer from some sort of disorder.
Correct.
That pushes them. So does that mean that they're evil, or does, I look at it from the standpoint of I don't know. I can't see into the head. I don't know if there's something wrong that has contributed to this, or if that's their nature. I'm not going to condemn them for what I don't know.
Well, I think what you and I mean by that, though, is that we're not going to morally condemn them, but we do believe in justice and punishment.
Yeah, 100% agree. Yeah, law. That's a great distinction. I'm not going to label them as evil, but I have no problem labeling what they did as evil,
and criminal.
The judgment that comes is a result of the actions that were taken.
Correct.
And the results of those actions.
And I think you and I, we have a notion that, let's say, because of our Christian perspective, when someone dies and they go to stand before God to be judged, that God will judge perfectly because he has access to perfect knowledge about them and their conditions and whether there were mitigating factors, abused as children, psychological, mental, emotional disorders within them that explained their behavior, that adjusted their culpability. In a
everyone gets a degree of difficulty sense. Added in on that judgment.
Right. So we as humans are probably not well suited. We are not well suited to make any sort of final moral judgment ultimately about someone. Again, I think we agree that we are expected and encouraged, both divinely and under human law, to
human conscience,
adjudicate the moral value of people's behavior. So,
well, and I also think it's important to point out, just because of circumstances, somebody who grew up in unfortunate circumstances, any atrocities that are committed, that doesn't excuse it.
Doesn't justify
it. And if they have broken God's laws, whatever religion you believe, if it comes to a time when you will be weighed or judged, I think some of those things will be taken into account, but it doesn't excuse what you did.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't, based on our earthly judgment. We are expected to do our best job to be fair and just, but we won't be able to see perfectly. So it's hard to know in somebody's head what's going on. We can only judge what we see.
Now, in contrast to that, in our real life experience, as authors, we are omniscient when it comes to the motives and the backgrounds and everything about our characters. We're more than omniscient, we're omnipotent as well. We are in control and fully create every aspect of our characters. And we we're very interested and sensitive to depict people realistically, and that includes people who choose, for one reason or another, to do acts that are evil. Now, I think you and I. So there's this great quote that Orson Scott Card wrote into one of his greatest characters ever, which is Ender Wiggins, the protagonist of Ender's Game, and in there, and he explores this to some extent at the end of Ender's Game, even more in Speaker for the
more
Dead
in the second
Xenocide. And that is, Ender says when he defeats the enemy. Sorry, slight spoiler, but when he defeats the enemy, he explains that in order to defeat the enemy, he had to come to understand the enemy but in coming to understand the enemy, he learned to love the enemy. And I think that's extremely profound. And as writers, we have found, I've found certainly, that I have the ability to love all of my characters, even the ones who do evil things, because I understand, I'm able to so thoroughly inhabit their inner world, their reasoning, that we understand them. Now, what I will say is, so far in book one, we have not, for example, made any of our primary characters psychopaths.
Right.
We haven't made any of them sadistic. We haven't portrayed a sadistic character yet, and we're unlikely to do that, and in part because we don't want to write graphically horrible things in our book. So even though horrible things do take place, now someone might argue whether or not we depict horrible things. Like
I was going to say that. I think that's debatable.
And then I've had readers be like, "Wait a minute, like you have some serious body horror going on in your books." And I'm like, "No, we don't." And then they're like, "What about the bonded, or what about the heads in the village?" And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, maybe there's some, maybe there's a little bit of that going on." But I don't think we've shown, say, the vivisection of anyone or the actual torture.
No,
we
have talked about heinous acts that have happened, but it's all been off.
It's all off camera.
So we deal with the repercussions.
We show the aftermath,
horrendous things, but we don't do a lot of showing it firsthand.
Right, and we're not interested in showing horror, and violence and torture and graphic things.
Yeah.
Either on the, we're not interested in showing any of that, like sexual graphic. It's not going to be in our books. We're never going to go above a PG-13 level in our books. And we're not interested in showing that on the violence or the horror and in depicting evil, where because evil by at least in our definition, includes harming people. We're just not interested in showing evil acts as they're being carried out. We will show that they happened and the aftermath. Things.
Yeah, we do show some of those things that have just happened. We have times when it's clear that is going on. A good example is Evir when he goes into Ifa.
So a warning here.
The Purge.
Yeah. So a warning. We're about to get into some spoilers from the book.
Yeah.
So
nothing like your spoiler for Ender's Game, which you called a little spoiler, and it totally spoils the entire ending. But we're going to talk about some specific examples within our book on how evil might be depicted, and why, in many ways, we don't see our characters
like both
evil,
sides. But yes,
not to the same extent that a lot of other writers might, or maybe just as readers would see. As we talk about some of these things, we'll talk about a few scenes from the book. We'll be careful not to spoil any endings, but we do want to make sure that we can address some of the things in our writing, some of the ways we depict good and evil, and probably why we don't picture our characters necessarily as evil, but clearly evil acts are done throughout the story.
Yeah, so we don't have anyone who could be described as a villain in our book. Now, there are enemies, there are antagonists, depending on the storyline, but we wanted specifically to show that the antagonists, we wanted to make them some of them protagonists as well. So for example, Romalia, the primary kingdom that the book one starts with, the brothers are Andric and Stafir, the princes of the kingdom, and they go to war against the Kushani Empire, who are their neighbors. The Kushani are antagonists, but we end up showing that not the Kushani aren't a monolith. There are groups and individuals within the Kushani Empire who don't align with the emperor. They don't want to perform slavery, or if they do perform slavery, they're opposed to chattel slavery, and they form they socially they use a different form called
and traditions are very different than some of the others.
Yeah, which is and so Andric is confronted with he's morally opposed to slavery as he understands it, which is sort of chattel slavery, like the American slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. But he is confronted with people who perform something a bit more like indentured servitude, who find it, even though they themselves were slaves under that system, like the system, they see the benefits of it, and they want to keep that system in place. And
Andric is still not comfortable with that,
right?
But he recognizes there's also a difference in degree on what the Imperial Kushani are doing and what the Venassi in this case are doing.
So we take ideas of things that people would find evil, and we explore them by creating different scenarios in which it's much more difficult to say with absolute certainty in every case that something is evil, whether that is a religion. Right. And some religions seem to be more susceptible to people committing evil acts in the name of that religion or in line with that religion's theology. But there are people within each religion who reject turning to harmful behaviors that hurt other people and find a way within the context of that theological system to be good, to align themselves with behavior that doesn't hurt other people. And we,
I think that in many ways, in our current world and the political climate that we have
on Earth,
we tend to go back to that tropey form of evil and good, and we try to make our adversaries into dastardly villains, and we simplify good and evil in our minds because it's cleaner for us. It's easier for us to say the other side is evil, they're bad, they are Sauron, they are Vader, whatever,
MAGA Republicans are evil, they're fascists or whatever, or whatever. The other side, the Democrats are, destroying civilization, or in Europe,
to use U.S. terms, absolutely. I think part of the reason we do that is it makes it easier to be tribal.
We otherize,
dislike the other side,
our enemy.
Part of what we do on purpose is to try to deconstruct that a little bit, and
we as writers,
as in our stories, we try to deconstruct that and show examples of things that one character might have generalized that, this is bad always, and it's horrendous what they're doing, and then maybe learns that, okay, well, not everybody's doing it this way, and maybe there are some aspects of this that I hadn't considered. It doesn't mean it's right, but it's maybe this isn't as bad as I had originally thought. I think Andric's journey is a good example of that. Not that he ends up thinking that things are great in Vanishar, but that his eyes are opened a little bit as to the differences, whereas he had just painted them with one broad stroke.
Yeah, so Andric gets introduced a lot to circumstances that challenge his overly simplistic view of the world. Another character that we have is Avir, and Avir is a high-level government agent official among the Kuldrith, who are an authoritarian government. They're led by an overlord who it is seeking to establish a worldwide empire. And Avir's job is to help the empire grow and maintain control internally. In book one, he's tasked specifically, he works for the intelligence agency called the Obsidian Door. He's tasked with tracking down, hunting down, and eliminating, bringing to justice rebels. Now, like you referenced Star Wars earlier, in Star Wars, the Empire is simplistically evil. They're all evil. They're monolithically evil.
Right.
At least in the original movies, they're that way. And the rebels are the good ones, right? And that is the good versus evil dichotomy is sort of unquestioned in.
And it's part of what people liked about it.
It's simple. It's clean.
Yeah, it is simple and it's clear.
We're not interested in that. So we wanted to show that initially that there are those in Andric and Stafir's storyline who view the Kuldrith as simplistically evil, like the evil empire.
Yeah.
We wanted to have people have that view, but then we wanted to give the reader the opportunity to see for themselves that there are people who don't fall cleanly into that dichotomy of evil. But we start with someone who's an enforcer for the empire. Avir is an inquisitor in the Obsidian Door who hunts down the rebels within the Kuldrith Empire, other Kuldrith, and eliminates them, eliminates the threat to the empire's order. And you get to see what his motives are. And even Avir is uncomfortable with some of the brutality that is used to exert control. But he also participates in it. He allows torture to happen. He orders torture to be used to extract information from prisoners who were rebels. And you could say, well, sorry, anyone who allows torture is automatically evil. We're gonna give you the opportunity to test that, the boundaries of your conviction of that, as you see Avir's story unfold.
Yep.
And we don't believe, again, Bob, this is what you were saying, we don't believe that anyone reasonably can be called entirely evil. Like, you are an evil person, full stop. That is way too simplistic for anyone on Earth or in our fictitious world. And our view of what is driving human behavior at its most fundamental level, these moral systems that people align themselves to in the gods, is one of the primary things that we're interested in exploring. Is people almost nobody, we think, is ultimately driven purely by a desire to harm other people for nothing more than the sadistic pleasure of doing it. Almost everyone is trying to get something for themselves. Now, you could say, well, that is evil, being selfish and harming other people to get some benefit for yourself. Yep. Possibly, and fair enough. Yeah, I mean, that's,
valid point.
But
sometimes that's true.
Sometimes that's true, but it gets way more complicated than that. And if all you ever think about in terms of judging human behavior is, if I don't approve of it, it is therefore evil, is way too simplistic in our view. People are way more complicated than that, and we want to explore those ideas in our book. What do you think of Frey?
I think Frey's a good example of that. Frey is certainly a sympathetic character. He's funny. He's with Stafir, and he's Stafir's best friend. Stafir is the prince who someday might be king, and Frey is kind of his right-hand man. He's a phenomenal swordsman. He's charismatic. He also happens to partake of alcohol a little bit more than maybe he should, and lives more of a party life. And cheats on his wife, is known to frequent brothels, and has had multiple affairs.
Yeah.
So
He's a womanizer,
he's
a
an ugly
partier. He's
mix.
hedonistic,
Yep.
and his
Yep.
and he, particularly when he leaves his wife back in the city to go visit the capital city with where the king and the court. He needs to go to court.
Yeah.
And he is selfish and self-indulgent when he gets there. Does that make him evil? I don't think we're interested in a passing judgment for the reader in every case. We will depict human nature in all of its glory and all of its horror, and everything in between, the spectrum, because again, we want to give people the opportunity to see how the gods' philosophies are lived and how that might translate into the real world, into Earth, into your own life. And when you are not living by your own moral system that you think is right or wrong, what might be driving that? Why might you struggle to always live based on the values that you yourself hold as your ideal, but you fall short? Why is that? What might be behind that?
I think Frey's a good example in that I don't see him as evil. I see him as flawed.
Certainly flawed.
And I can without a doubt unequivocally condemn behavior that he does, but that doesn't necessarily make him as a person evil. He has redeeming qualities as well, but I think it's important to be able to condemn behavior without calling someone evil for mistakes that they made, whether they keep making them or not. And Frey's a good example of somebody who, he may see his marriage very differently than I do, for sure, and may justify it. We haven't seen things from his perspective yet.
You will in book 2, by the way.
Regardless, hey, spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. We gave the spoiler alert at
Yes, we did. But I mean, for me, he's a good example of somebody who's flawed, somebody who has clear moral problems. He certainly does not live his life in a manner that I would think would be honorable and the right way to live, good by my definition. However, it doesn't make him good or evil. It means some of his actions would fall into that, but I see him as a flawed individual.
Yeah. Now
we hope to explore those flaws in many of our characters,
and not just in our characters, but in groups as a whole, religious, whole religions, like people committing genocide or something close to it. Widespread killing through war, through oppression, through whatever. Like we show lots and lots and lots of both people doing things that we would certainly label as evil, and plenty of people doing things that we would label as good, and people that you might think and have a tendency to categorize them as people as evil, doing good things, moral things, and people who are good doing things that are maybe morally reprehensible, and everything in between. So we invite you to consider our writing, especially as more books come out, and we'll get more into you'll see more of this as the story unfolds, exploring how messy this area of human nature and human morality really can be.
Yeah. I think that's part of the goal between what you and I are doing, is just trying to give a realistic depiction of what life would be like in these kinds of times, and the fact that we can point to very difficult times in human history on Earth and recognize that there were atrocities committed. It doesn't mean everybody in one country is bad. I grew up in the Cold War. A lot of times it was painted that the Russians are bad and the Americans are the good guys. And
Soviets, yeah.
there's an argument to be made for some of that. Yeah, but truthfully, we knew all along there were good people in the Soviet
Right.
Union and there were bad people in the United States, and it's part of the human condition. We wanted to give a depiction of people in a realistic human condition in a fantasy setting, and in end times events.
Right, as a means of exploring the themes of the book, which are philosophical systems as they play out through the end times. So, okay,
absolutely.
We could go on and on about this. We're at the end of our time.
I think that's more than enough for today.
Yeah. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about your ideas. What do you think evil is? Have we missed the boat on it? Do you think that any of our depictions in our book are unrealistic? What are you looking forward to seeing more of or less of? We'd love to hear any of your thoughts. So leave some comments below. And if you haven't yet, we'd love for you to subscribe and follow us. And until next time, keep enjoying the journey.
Thank you. Have a good one.